The Allegory of the Fire. Cold and dark, but in the distance you see a fire. As you approach, you feel its warmth, and can see within its light. You move closer, the warmth grows. The light is brighter. Nearer still, you become uncomfortable. It's too warm. You try to move away, but you're pulled forward, or perhaps pushed by an invisible hand. This close to the fire, it is too hot. Sparks sting like wasps, and the smoke chokes you like brutal hands. You want to move away, back to the pleasant warmth, but you are pushed forward. You hear anguished screams over the fire's crackle. You see people burning within the flames. They stand upon a heap of charred bone and ash. This fire has burned a long time. You are shoved into the flames. As it consumes you, you understand that many who bask in the fire have no idea what it burns. Others know full well. They command the fire be fed, and they are obeyed. This fire is racism in all its forms, and its fuel is human beings. Much like Plato's famous line, and of course his allegory of the cave, the allegory of the fire involves various zones. And so, obviously, there is the fire, there is the zone that is too hot, the zone that is too warm, and the zone that is just right. And also, of course, in the allegory, there is the invisible hand shoving a person into the fire. So what is the explanation or analysis of this allegory? Now, there's, of course, the fire itself. And this would be analogous to being fully within the worst harms of racism. For example, a person who has been wrongly imprisoned because of factors of racism, all throughout the system, and end up, say in a worst case scenario, being imprisoned for life, or even worse, sentenced to death for something that they did not do, and they're in prison because of the racism that's working throughout the system. And that would be in the fire. Or, of course, to draw the analogy to the charred bones and ashes of having been killed because of racism. And this could include being actively killed because of racism. For example, people who have been killed because of the police killing them, presumably because of racism. Cases, of course, of lynching throughout history, and recently, of course. And also not direct acts of violence, but people dying because they lack, say, the economic resources to survive, lack health care. So not actively killed by racism, but dying nonetheless because of it. And that would be being in the fire. The zone that could be regarded as too hot would be analogous to the people who are harmed by aspects of racism, but the harms are not as great as within the fire itself. For example, people who have enough financial resources to avoid some of the most brutal harms of racism, yet still suffer quite a bit from racism. For example, having considerable difficulty in securing a mortgage, or once they get one, being significantly overcharged for it, and suffering various significant harms. That would be like being in the too hot zone, where racism is like sparks constantly landing on one's skin, smoke constantly choking one. In the too warm zone, that can include two types of people. One group of people would be those who actually experience the lesser harms of racism, but not the full effects that one would encounter like in the too hot or fire zone. To use kind of an extreme example, one I saw being discussed on YouTube was a case involving an African American celebrity who gets pulled over while driving while black. And of course initially things could go very badly, but fortunately for this person, they're recognized as being a well-known comedian in films and so forth. And so instead of things ending terribly, they end not terribly. So everyone goes home. And so in that case, the person wasn't subject to significant harms. They were still harmed because they're pulled over, and they only escape harm because they happen to be a celebrity. But it would be an example of a situation that would be, too warm, sort of at the edges of the harms. Now, also in this group would be those who are not themselves the target of racism, but they're aware of its existence, and they find it uncomfortable. They find it, wrong and unpleasant. And this can come in varying degrees. These zones, are not absolute. They come in various degrees of say, like the amount of harm done, etc. And so in the case of the discomfort, a person may be sort of, morally upset when they see, on TV, someone being murdered by a police officer, but they're not super, affected by it. They go on with their life. And then, of course, there are those who they find racism to be, incredible evil, and they have a burning hatred for it. And that causes them considerable, discomfort. Not actual harm, because they're not targeted by racism, but it is uncomfortable. And so in the too warm zone would people that are kind of at the edges of harm, or aware and uncomfortable with racism in varying degrees. It's something, unpleasant, something they don't like, they don't want, and may hopefully regard as morally terrible. So what about the just right zone? Well, in the just right zone are three, different types of people. There are those who benefit from racism while being ignorant of it. So they just go on with their life, and willfully or not, they're generally unaware of racism. Maybe if they were really, questioned about it, they might say that it exists, but generally they don't encounter it. It doesn't really register them, and they do benefit from it in some degree. Typically not like extreme degrees. They get some benefit from it, but no clear and obvious benefit that they can clearly connect to racism. The second group are those who are aware of racism, and they benefit from this racism. They know full well what they're getting, and they're okay with it. They're not discomforted by it. They're not actively, perpetuating the system themselves, very actively, except by being within it, but they do benefit and they're aware of what's occurring. The third group are those who play an active role in this system. They are, to use the metaphor, they are like the hand in the allegory. And these would be, the hand itself would be the metaphor for the people, institutional processes, rules, policies, and traditions that inflict racism. And in this third group are those who are aware of racism, benefit from it, and actively try to maintain and enhance it. And this would include those who command, which would include politicians who either are racist or, in a way it makes no difference, are willing to engage in racist policies, rhetoric, etc., to benefit from it. Same with like business leaders, other leaders and influencers. And again, people often debate endlessly about, is this person really a racist? Or are they just saying things racist adjacent? And that can be interesting from a psychological standpoint. And there is a philosophical distinction between being a racist and just, say, exploiting racism or being racism adjacent. But from the standpoint of people who are in the fire, it really doesn't matter if the person shoving you into the fire, really believes in racism or is just shoving you in the fire because they want to be warmer. So, in a way, it doesn't really matter if they're truly racist or not. So that debate, again, while theoretically interesting, really has no practical application in terms of the people who are being shoved into the fire. There are, of course, those who obey, and this would be what we consider to be, police. And again, we always have to say not all police are bad, which is, true. Just like any profession, not everyone is terrible. And similarly with judges, and we can't say that all judges are bad because some do rule against racism, but there are judges who are actively involved. And of course, people working for politicians, business leaders, other leaders, and influencers, because you can't have a broad system of, institutional racism without a lot of people contributing, either knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly. And so those are the the zones and the groups. Now, the allegory, of course, can be extended beyond racism. There are numerous fires in our civilization. Someone can be shoved into the fire because of their sex, because they're a woman. People are shoved into the fire because of their economic class. Obviously because they're poor. If you're rich, you don't get pushed into that economic fire. People's gender can lead them to being pushed into the fire. Sexual orientation, religion, pretty much any factor people can dislike and want to, harm someone, either to gain some advantage or get something, or just to hurt them. These are all fires. Now, a person, of course, can be both the burned and the burner. For example, a poor white man might support racist policies, while at the same time, they're being shoved into the economic fire when they're forced to choose between working in a pandemic or suffering economic ruin. And so people can be both shoved and shovers, which is part of the brutality of our system. Now, what about criticizing this allegory? Because one of the important things about at least trying to be a proper philosopher, and my profession, is philosopher, and also kind of my disposition is philosophical, you always have to be willing to accept rational criticism of your position. Now, what counts as a rational position can, of course, be debated as well, but the idea is that you have to be willing to consider, mistakes you might make, weak points in your argument, because the objective in philosophy, at least for some, including myself, is to achieve truth. And that requires being able to accept criticism and not simply, clinging mindlessly to a view. So what are ways the allegory can be criticized and attacked? Well, I'm kind of obviously making an argument by analogy here, because I'm saying, that racism's like a fire. Fire is, being in fire is super harmful. Therefore, racism is super harmful. And so kind of the implied argument is that I'm arguing against racism. We shouldn't be shoving people into that fire. We should put that fire out. So when assessing any argument by analogy, there are three standards. And it's an inductive argument, which means that if all the premises are true, at best the conclusion is probably true. And you assess them in terms of being strong or weak. So the more similarities between the two things being compared, the better. The more relevant they are, the better. The more relevant dissimilarities, the worse for the argument. So if you want to attack my implied analogy, attack the allegory, this is what you'd go after. You would want to try to show that I don't have enough similarities between the two. You'd want to also go after the relevance to argue that they're not relevant, and you'd also want to point out relevant dissimilarities. And to the degree that can be done, that would show the implied argument is weak. Now, one can also go after the part about, racism. One could argue that racism is not that bad, that perhaps it exists, but it's not like being in the fire. It's like maybe being in the discomfort zone, where it's a little bit warm, but not really that bad. And there are people who make that argument. And if that can be proven, that racism is really not that bad, then my allegory of the fire, you could still have an allegory, but it would be, a pretty lame allegory, that racism is like standing, a little too close to the fire, where you're a little uncomfortable and sweaty, but not that bad. One could also argue that racism doesn't even exist. And there are people who argue that. So in this case, the argument would be essentially to show that there is no fire. Now, another option that people sometimes do is to argue that people are getting what they deserve. So the people who are in the fire, who happen to be a certain type of people, they're just getting what they deserve. So there's no problem with this, because even though one might admit that, yes, they're getting burned, one could contend that they deserve to be burned. And of course, people sometimes do all of these at once. That racism is not that bad. Oh, it doesn't exist. And by the way, people are getting what they deserve. Now, there are other ways as well. But since it's, my argument, I'm not going to spend more time trying to, criticize it, but I do, of course, welcome criticisms of the argument that are considered, thought out, and at least kind of philosophical. And so that brings us to the end of the philosophical part of the allegory of fire.